evening, everybody. Thank you for turning out on this Monday evening. Myself and Julian. Jules, are you there?
I'm here.
Excellent. That's a relief. And we also have joining us Graham Anderson. Graham, are you there?
Hi there. Good afternoon. Good evening.
Hello, Graham. Graham is our special guest this evening. Opted in at late notice. Thank you for rocking out. That's extremely gratifying, Graham. So there's me and Jules a few years ago. This is Graham Anderson, elite physio, and probably I would say Jules, our long-standing collaborator. I can't think of anybody we worked before with Graham. Can you?
No, I think Graham was the first physio to realise the connection between bike fitting and bike injuries, and that just treating the injury wasn't going to resolve the problem.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, 20 years ago, when we were sort of developing the Cyclefit system and we were sort of peddlers of snake oil, Graham was the first person that rocked up and said, no, there's something in this. And we were absolutely blown away, weren't we? We couldn't believe that somebody as high value as Graham had rocked through our doors and said, no, I'm really interested in this. Let's work together. Do you remember that, Graham?
Just about a long time ago.
Yeah, 20 years, over 20 years ago. Over 20 years ago. So Graham is an elite physio. If Andy Murray's got hurt his backhand or whatever he uses and falls over at Wimbledon, Graham's the guy you'll see run on, responsible for sorting it all out in short shrift. There we are. There you are. Is that with Djokovic there, Graham?
That's right.
Yeah. So elite physio and one of the most experienced physiotherapists we've ever worked with, probably the most experienced physiotherapist we ever worked with, and somebody we work with a lot. Some of you may have even seen Graham or worked with us and Graham together. And when we started our Cyclefit Science Symposium back in 2012, an international symposium which we ran for a few years, we made sure Graham was literally our first speaker and introduced the symposium. And there's Graham on screen up here on the right hand side, and he was the first speaker of our first ever symposium in London, 2012. What was the title of the talk, Graham?
Cyclefit, art, science, or bullshit, was it something like that? I
think it was bike fitting, art, science, or bullshit. A great talk. So this Graham's going to come with us this evening on the journey, and will be available to answer questions of a physiotherapy, injury, pain nature. So, okay, so second talk in our series, and this one's all about peddling. Now, you could literally write a book about this, and you could give a whole series of lectures about this. So we're going to probably leave a little bit out. And if there's something that you think should be in there, please raise your hand, and I'm sure it's somewhere deep in our subconscious. Pedal like a pro. So this is the bit where you do a bit of an exam, a bit of a test, and there's 10 questions here, and I want you to answer them in your head or on paper as we go through them, and let me know how many positives you have at the end of it. So pedaling in circles is inherently superior to mashing the pedals. Clippers pedals were developed to allow pedaling through the circle. We need to aim for pedaling smoothness or souplesse. We should work to eliminate the dead spots at the bottom of the pedal stroke. I'm not sure why that's gone weird, but it has. We should focus more on pulling up to recruit more muscles. The higher the cadence, the better for power and efficiency. Pedaling sitting is better than standing for producing power. Longer cranks deliver more power. Ankling or dropping the ankle is the way to gain souplesse and to develop a more advanced pedal stroke. And then the last one, less pedal float delivers more power. So how many got? We've got 10. Anyone out there got 10 yeses or positives on that test? Jules, has anyone got their hand up?
I can't see hands, Phil. I can't see anybody.
Oh, okay, fine. Has anyone got 0 out of 10 there? Has anyone answered no to all of those? Jules, anyone got their hand up?
I can't see, Phil, that you can't see hands in a webinar,
Okay.
not unless you invite everyone.
All right.
Let's assume it was about 8 out of 10.
Okay. We can do that. So this is the stuff that's out there right now that may be influencing what we believe. This is from What Bike, and you may or may not be able to hear this. The sound when we went through this was a little bit poor. Oh, come on, thinking about it.
Can you hear it, Phil?
I can hear it really well, yeah.
All right. I think it's just maybe it's just coming through your earphones.
It's not coming through my earphone.
No.
So it says there that the what they're saying is there that the unsophisticated pedal stroke is one that is not recruiting the upstroke, so it's too dominant on the downstroke. So, and then What Bike goes on to explain that they should be scraping mud off your shoes through the bottom of the pedal stroke and trying to create a smooth sausage. So the elite pedal technique is one where the person can fill in the gaps.
That's the peanut, isn't it?
Yeah. So that the elite pedal stroke is one where you can smooth off these dead spots at the top of the pedal stroke and at the bottom of the pedal stroke. And the technique for doing that, as far as I could ascertain, is where you're pulling back at the bottom and you're driving the pedal forward at the top. And this is relatively recent stuff. So What Bike is inviting you to not just push down on the pedal stroke, because that's an amateur and inferior pedal stroke, but to try and create some drive through the upstroke and then through the backstroke and to the top of the pedal stroke, and that, as they call that, an elite technique. Do you have any opinions about that, Graham?
I think if you're elite, maybe you have a better chance, but I think it's very difficult to push pull so fast.
In terms of proprioception, you mean?
Not only in terms of proprioception, but more muscle physiology, in the sense that, can you get one muscle group and then a whole other muscle group to switch on, switch off so quickly?
Yeah. So that's out there from What Bike, and then this is out there from Trainer Road. Now I've got to give these guys some credit. Jules, you listened to this afternoon. I listened to it as well. Can you hear that?
No.
So these guys are trying to define what superlative, and they end up by talking about what pedal stroke is pretty. So at the bottom there, the quote there: Nate has a pretty pedal stroke, and you have a pretty pedal stroke. So these are quite technical, sciencey guys, and they end up defining an effective pedal stroke by what it looks like. And they're talking about heels up, heels down, and what component of that is effective. And I mean, to give them credit, they are actually trying to deconstruct this, and I think in a much more positive way than What Bike. And they're quite careful to say that you don't pull up too much, but they are trying to end up a perfect pedal stroke, but are not quite sure what the components of that are. Would you agree? Is that a fair analysis, Jules?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think, I mean, we can always look at cyclists and say they have a nice pedal technique, but it's why is that technique? Why does that technique look good? I suppose is that subjective, or is it an objective thing? Ooh.
Yeah, it's true of any sport, isn't it? As a runner, you don't have to look pretty to be effective. Two runners coming out of a block, sprinting, one's all over the shop, one's like a train, not necessarily going to be the fastest one. So,
and you can look good on one side and not on the other.
Exactly, as long as you're producing the power that's required and your body is happy with it, which we can talk about later. Yeah, agree.
So I mean, Jules and I grew up through the old school, through the whole club system where we were coached to scrape mud off our shoes and pull up and pull back and all that kind of stuff, high heels and all that sort of stuff. And it wasn't until we started bike fitting and we were trying to create a system that we kind of had a moment in the kitchen one day making a coffee and kind of went, I'm not sure that whole pull up thing exists. So and we both were kind of thinking the same thing. And then we kind of sat around thinking, well, why would that be? And it's about evolved function. So Lucy on the left there, we're talking 3 million years ago, moved through to a bipedal humanoid type figure, and then you've got the kind of caveman 130,000 years ago, and then you've got, who's that, Jules, on the right?
Julian Bernard.
Julian Bernard, 2016. Now, there's not much between Julian Bernard and the caveman. I don't mean that in a personal sense. There's not much in terms of the genome. There's not a huge amount of difference. I mean, this guy here might be lactose intolerant, but if they were different genders, they could quite happily mate and come out with an offspring. They're not entirely different genomes. So you've got to, in terms of what we're designed for, you've got to look at what this guy was designed to do rather than what this guy is doing now. Is that fair? That's where we started, Graham, in terms of, and that's one of our kind of cornerstones now, is what we evolved to do rather than what we are doing. Is that fair, Graham?
Yeah, we've evolved to be more upright, more extension orientated, I guess. Yeah. Oh, you're going to talk about that now.
Right. Well, yeah, I am. So yeah. So if you think about the caveman 130,000 years ago, they were evolved to essentially run away from prey, or run away from a predator, or run towards prey. They have evolved to be powerful in extension. So extension being glute contraction, which extends the hip, quad contraction, which extends the knee, and then ankle plantar flexion, which extends the ankle. So as a human, as a biped, they were evolved to be very, very powerful in extension and not in flexion. And there you can see Mark Cavendish in his beautiful sprinting style, very much echoing that kind of extensive contraction. Is that fair to say, Graham?
Yeah, I think we're historically stronger in extension. Yeah, simple as that.
Yeah. So all the while that Bike and Trainer Roads and lots of others, and we shouldn't single those guys out, talking about trying to elongate the pedal stroke, try and bring in different parts of the pedal stroke to be constructive and power producing. That's what they're trying to elongate, how much contact you've got with the pedal stroke. So they're not content for you to have contact on the downstroke. They want to have contact on the backstroke, upstroke, and then through the top. But the problem with that is it's at odds with our bipedal function. So elite runners, for example, and Alex would have, I'm not sure if Alex is on. Is Alex on tonight, Jules, or not? Alex,
7-ish, I think.
Oh, Alex is going to come on at 7. So elite runners aim for, and Alex is an ex-GB 400-meter runner, so that's why he would be interesting on this point. Elite runners aim for under 200 milliseconds of GCT, ground contact time. So they're trying to minimize how much time they're in contact with the ground, and yet cyclists have evolved this mythology about maximizing how much time we've got in contact with the ground, or our version of the ground, which of course is the pedal. And mine and Jules's contention has always been, well, we're down with number 2 here, minimizing the contact time, but making that contact time more effective. So elite runners aren't producing less power, they're producing more power, but they're producing more power in a very small amount of time. Fair to say, Jules?
Yes, correct. Yeah, I think we've got a spin scan later, but it shows you a sprinter, and you can see the curves on his spin scan, and he has a peak on his spin scan. He's not trying to round out his pedal stroke. He's just effectively just pushing around about 5 o'clock, isn't he, on the pedal stroke? Just getting that little flick through the pedal stroke, where his leg is it's most extended when he's in the saddle and when he's standing on the pedals.
Yeah, absolutely. We are going to get to him. It's Sam Bennett that we're going to get to. So weak inflection, hip flexors are postural muscles, really, rather than power muscles. Graham, jump in here at any point if I'm committing some kind of physio cardinal sin. The power is essentially, if you look at the diagram on the left, it's all about springing away from the ground in that moment of explosive power to escape a predator. And that's the moment of force that we're trying to capture on the bike. Fair to say, Graham?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And there's another thought experiment here that we can bring in. Let's assume everyone's now sitting on Zwift or on the road or on a climb, or they're going up Ventoux, and you're absolutely at your maximum. You really can't go any harder. You know, all you've got left is that final burst of 50 meters of sprinting. You're literally on your threshold. So you're now fueling the muscles that you've got to their maximum. You're using your whole cardiovascular system to its maximum. How then would you fuel, if you were then to try and use your hip flexors and your rec fem and these little muscles? What have you got left to fuel those with? You're already using all the power, cardiovascular power that you've got. You don't have any cardiovascular headroom or bandwidth to start fueling these little postural muscles. Is that a preposterous statement, Graham?
Yeah, no, totally. But I think as well, what's confusing for a lot of people is the conditioning people try to do to try and improve this as well, in the sense that you've got to look at both power, torque, and strength. And strength can be absolute strength or relative strength, or power strength, like sort of explosive strength, and then endurance as well. And all those things, if they're not trained, you're going to fall off the bus, and any imbalance between your extensors and flexors will be exaggerated even further. So even if it's a momentary imbalance between your extensors and flexors, that becomes a bigger problem with endurance, and torque becomes involved with it as well.
Right. So that leads us to this diagram here, this diagram was produced by Dr. Jeff Broker, who Graham knows and we know, and actually spoke at the same conference that you spoke at, Graham, I believe, didn't he?
Yeah,
and produced his data. Now, pardon? Yeah. So Dr. Jeff Broker was one of the first people to test this theory about the upstroke. Did it exist? And he 100 elite cyclists under the microscope with these piezoelectric sensors in the pedals, and we're going to hear from him in a little bit at the conference. And so he examined how much power could be produced in all parts of the pedal stroke, and he related it as a clock face. And one of his subjects was a young, very youthful cyclist who was incredibly powerful, but was being criticized at the time for his very, very brutal pedal stroke, unnecessarily brutal. And that guy's name was Lance Armstrong. So Lance Armstrong was one of Jeff Broker's subjects in this. And Jeff Broker produced all the data. And out of all the 100 professional elite cyclists, mountain bikers, road cyclists, Tour de France cyclists, sprinters, track sprinters, the whole lot, not one of them produced any meaningful upstroke, or did. So these arrows here are showing force, and that's the downstroke, the power stroke. And you see the force increases, as Jules says, the force increases around here to 4 or 5 o'clock, and then the force maintains as it goes through the bottom of the pedal stroke. Now, that's not all meaningful power, by the way, because although the pedal is being loaded, it's not actually effective force because of the angle of the crank, the bottom bracket. So yes, you're producing force, but not all that is effective force. And then as you go up through the back of the pedal stroke here, this is the upstroke, look at this, we've still got negative torque on the crank. So even those guys who thought they were producing upstroke were not producing upstroke. Actually, they were still negatively loading the pedal. But it didn't matter, because on the other side, they were positively loading the pedal so much that they were more than compensating and creating great drive. So even the guys that thought they were producing upstroke weren't producing upstroke. It was a mythology. And that's an aggregate of all Dr. Broker's subjects, 100 subjects. Jules, anything you want to say on there?
I think one of the things he said was that the mountain bikers had the best pedal stroke. They had the smoothest stroke, whereas the road riders tended just to slam the pedals down more. Whereas the mountain biker would have a smoother stroke, so they wouldn't lose traction on steep climbs. That was quite a big take home for that one. But the pedal stroke wasn't necessarily smooth, was it, from the pros?
No, and in fact, the higher the power, the less smooth it was. So the track sprinters had the shortest power delivery of all the cyclists. The mountain bikers, it was thought, had the longest power delivery. I think Jeff was saying because of traction issues. So you're getting to the top of a climb, and it's kind of shaly, loose surface, and you kind of unconsciously pedal a slightly different way to try and deal with traction issues. And it's kind of the guys that had the shortest power stroke with the match sprinters, the track sprinters. So and this is kind of, and you may want to come in here, Graham, at some point. But this kind of shows us the hardware that we're dealing with when we pedal, in terms of the downstroke and the upstroke. So our biggest driving muscle is our gluteal muscle, and that's the muscle shown on the left here. And then and its antagonist muscle is the group of muscles which are the hip flexors there. And they're a fairly small muscle group compared to the glute, which is huge. And that shows you which of these muscle groups has evolved to produce explosive power or power, and which hasn't evolved. And Graham, it's a question over here. Even if these were power driving muscles, is there a proprioceptive issue, a software issue in engaging those muscles as power muscles?
Well, proprioception is just the perception of position and movement of the body. Yeah, so it's just the firing, the timing patterns of what muscles work with what. So if you've got a dominant set of muscles over another set of muscles, your proprioceptive understanding is going to be a little bit off balance. Similarly, it can be driven by a central component, so the brain continually kind of makes tiny alterations to the joint position because of this proprioceptive feedback to it. But I think generally, if you're say, for example, your hip flexors are particularly tight and consequently potentially a little weaker, then you're going to have to adapt proprioceptively to overcome that. Or your glutes are imbalanced to the other side, or you have a difference in power from one side to the other. As a good example for proprioception, you would then have to adapt your pedal pressure to try and smooth that out. So it's kind of, proprioception can be dealt like a dampener, if you like, to imbalances too. Hip flexors, to me, are an important bit of kit for problems on bikes. Very useful to use your quads because, like you described, they're one of the main drivers in the downward pressure. But the vastus medialis, the vastus intermedialis, the vastus lateralis are pure quadriceps. But the fourth one, which you've got there, the rectus femoris, and that crosses the hip joints along with the iliacus and psoas. So the iliacus and psoas you've got mentioned there with the rectus femoris, they're the hip flexors, whereas the other three are just the pure quadriceps. So the fourth quadricep is the rectus femoris. And those become particularly tight if you're particularly in a tucked position, or you're sitting for long periods of time and that sort of area. And that again will affect your proprioceptive control if you have a group of tight muscles. The same way as the other side, if you've got particularly tight hamstrings, it will affect the extension component too.
Yeah, and I think we see that, Jules. And RecFem is a muscle group who. What happened there? RecFem is a muscle group whose length and tightness we test in the studio, isn't it?
Yes, I mean it can affect. It does cause quite a few problems with knee tracking, I think, and I think if the legs can be, if the leg's unstable, it can be overactive, and I think that causes a lot of problems to riders. And then they find if they get pain in the RecFem, then they try and work around it, and then they end up pulling up more, and that causes more problems. So they sort of get literally in a vicious circle with that muscle.
Yeah. The rec fem is important because, sorry, Graham, go on.
Do you have a slide on that at all? On one of mine.
If
you lengthen the tight one.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I do. Yes. Let me come out of here and I'll go down to your slides. Yeah. What was I thinking, Graham? These are Graham's slides, which he kindly.
Keep going down. Keep down. Yeah. So here, for example, is a two joint muscles. The rectus femoris goes over the hip, whereas the other three muscles of the quadriceps just go over the knee. Keep going down. But if you're in this tuck, go back again, sorry. If you're in this tucked position, such as in a time trial position or something like that, you're going to be much more prone to shortening your hip flexors. And then if you sit in a sedentary office posture all day long as well, you're just tightening further all the time. And like Jules is saying, that will then potentially put pressure on things like the knees as well. If we go to the next one, and quite commonly people talk about.
Yeah, sorry, Graham. Yeah,
quite people talk about snapping hip, which I don't really believe. Again, I think it's another little myth on cycling. It's generally not so much the rub of the iliopectoral eminence going over the pelvic bone, which is what snapping hips normally called. It's more femoroacetabular impingement. So that just means either the joint itself, which is the true femoroacetabular impingement, or just the soft tissue, which is more common at the front. And so consequently, if you go to the last slide there, like you say, you test, like that guy in the red there, you test the length of the hip flexors in that position, yeah, to overcome the person in the purple here, because that's the posture he's in all day long when he's not sitting on his bike. Yeah, so it becomes particularly tight. So the fix for that would be to go to like the lady there, where she's doing a Bulgarian split squat, to stretch the hip flexors out. So once you've got a muscle that's of an appropriate length, you can deal with your proprioception. But if you've got an imbalance of length, then the proprioception and the force through the pedal and everything else will be affected too. Plus also the length of the hip flexors will affect obviously the pelvic position. So the pelvic position will then affect the back or vice versa. And so then you may have an asymmetry around that area, which will again affect the pedal power, the pedal imbalance, and everything else. It's always a knock-on effect. Oh, there's Alex.
And would those tighter hip flexors, would they pull a rider's, if a rider's trying to extend his leg, would that pull a rider off to that side of the saddle effectively? Would they be able to extend their leg as well? Or would it pull their?
I think it depends. It depends on how the hip is talking to the back. If the back is particularly stiff, yes, it definitely would. If you've got a lot of flexibility where you can absorb that deficit in the hip flexor and extensors, then you could absorb it and not be seen.
Okay.
The body's very good at absorbing problems,
Yeah.
but it's also it's also good at knocking one problem onto somewhere else.
And would it encourage a rider, would they, if they were tight in that area, would that encourage their knees to come out at the top of the pedal stroke, do you think?
If they haven't got enough hip flexion, yes.
Yeah.
Which then obviously, as you know, can lead to knee pain.
Yeah.
So Alex has joined us on the webinar. Welcome, Alex.
Hi guys.
Right, I'm off then. You've got enough there.
Oh yeah, one in, one out.
I'll go back.
Bandwidth's gone.
So this is this slide of the rec fem. Do you just want to explain that, Graham, and its role in cycling here, the rec fem, or Alex, one of you?
It's just that you talk about the group of muscles. The group of muscles are not the group of quadriceps. They're the rectus femoris and the iliopsoas as well, which is up at the top. I'm showing with my cursor here. You probably can't see that. So because it goes over the hip, whereas the other vastus medialis, intermedialis, and lateralis are all just on the femur and go over the knee.
So the rec fem is both a knee extender and a hip flexor.
Exactly.
Right.
So
and that's why it's a. Sorry.
That's a better way to describe it. Yes.
Yeah. And that's why it's a tricky little muscle in cycling.
Yeah.
And there's that is a picture you took of me, Graham. I don't know why you've included that in your slide, but
Yeah.
okay.
Unusual shorts.
Yeah. Let's get back into the presentation there. Sorry. That's a nice rabbit hole. I'm sure we'll go down more. So this is a slide that Jules and this is one of our teaching slides, and I put it there because it's deliberately controversial. It's not a slide that I'm not sure we would use it on a course now, but this is a slide that we used on a lot of courses that we ran to try and teach students about group effort in cycling. And it was often a surprise when we put this slide up that they didn't expect some muscles to be so high and so low. So looking at that there, and of course these are aggregates, they're rough, they're approximate, and they're almost certainly wrong. But quadriceps producing 40% of your power, glutes producing, you know, almost a third, calf muscles 20%, and then you've got the knee flexor group of muscles, the hamstrings back here, and the hip flexors, the muscle group we've just been talking about, the tricky little muscle group, 4%. So, you know, 14% of power production is coming from the hamstring and hip flexor. Well, I don't think anything like that comes from those muscle groups. Actually, if you look at Jeff Broker's data down here, people can't even produce enough power onto in the upstroke to offset the weight of the leg. However, the point being that the majority of the power is coming from the big guns here, the glutes extending the hip, the quads extending the knee, and then the ankle plantar flexors or calf muscles here. Yeah, I'm not sure we'd run that slide anymore, Jules, would we, in a course? Maybe we would, but
I think it gives a good guide. I think it gives a good guide to how we're actually using our muscles. And I think you hear a lot about on different platforms about engaging the hamstrings in the pedal stroke. But they're you know, the hamstrings are there to balance the quads. They're there just to, they're not there to do any particular pulling or of the pedals, are they?
No, I mean, in fact, myself and Graham were having this conversation this afternoon. It's like the role of the hamstring in cycling is a strange one, isn't it? In terms of producing power, it doesn't produce a lot of power. It gets tight, but it doesn't produce a lot of power, does it? It doesn't, you know, it doesn't create torque onto the crank, if you like.
No.
So this is the same conference that Graham opened up. Graham opened the conference up, and then this guy Jeff Broker came over from America and delivered his talk. Now you probably won't be able to hear this, but essentially he was producing his data on the 100 cyclists that he tested in terms of whether in the pedal stroke they were producing power, and he created these takeaways. And the number one one, which I'll play now, which you probably won't hear.
No.
Sorry, no.
Okay, fine. So he says there, Jeff Broker says, cyclists that are being debunked there with hard data using his piezoelectric sensors, and that none of their 100 cyclists could produce any meaningful torque on the crank or could even offset the weight of their legs on the upstroke. And after that, it was pretty difficult to tell clients that they should be concentrating on their upstroke or their backstroke or anything else because professional cyclists couldn't maintain it. So going on to a bit more data here. This is the 2014 conference, 2 years after the one with Jeff Broker. And we had this superb talk from a guy called Dr. Jim Martin, very eminent biomechanist from the US. And he kind of spoke remotely at the conference. We dialed him in, and that's obviously very matter of fact now, but back in 2014, that was quite a technical lift, wasn't it, Jules? I remember we were running around there. We had him dial into the conference and deliver his talk remotely, and he got up, I think he was delivering this, I think 5:30 in the morning his time, in his lecture. There he is in his lecture theatre, lecturing to an empty lecture hall, but actually our lecture hall was rammed at XL. And the takeaway from his talk was that, and his data, is that he sampled elite and trained cyclists using 145 mil to 195 millimeter crank lengths He found there was no peak power difference between 145 and 195. Just let that sink in for a moment. If we go back to one of my questions right at the top here, one of the questions that me and Jules posed, it is, do longer cranks deliver more power? Well, longer cranks don't deliver more power, but they do deliver more torque. But what athletes are doing, Jim Martin found in his data, is they will automatically increase their cadence to hold on to exactly the same peak power. And that's the same from 145mm crank to 195mm crank. The problem is not all cyclists can use a 195mm crank. It's a very long crank, and you've got to have exceptional hip inflection range to use it. And we'll show an example in a minute of somebody who definitely couldn't have used a 195mm crank. But that research is quite liberating in a sense. It means use the crank that you feel best with. So with all that hard data, Jim Martin had a very simple conclusion. Use the crank you like best. Don't expect a power lift with a longer crank or a softening of power with a shorter crank, but just use the crank that feels most comfortable to you. And that was his takeaway. So now myself and Jules, if you're in a session with us, we're not overly prescriptive on crank length, but if you give us the choice and ask our opinion, we'll probably take shorter rather than longer, because shorter feels more comfortable. Fair to say, Jules?
I think that's fair to say, Phil. And also going back to the hip flexors, if you haven't got a good range there, then we'd recommend a shorter crank to keep that hip angle open.
Yeah, and let's just move ahead here and look at an example of somebody who definitely would have struggled with a 95mm crank. You might want to talk us through this.
Do you want to just open up the slide a bit more, Philip?
Yes, okay, I can do that.
Thank
Hold
you.
on. Not a problem. It might take me a second, Jules, but
okay. So this is oh, that was Julian Arredondo, who was I haven't got his numbers here, but he was quite a small rider, very powerful, good climber, and he appeared in the pro peloton for about a year, but he didn't really get on with it. And I don't know if you can see here, his leg extension is quite high, and he's really reaching for the pedals there. And the reason he had the saddle high was because he was trying to keep his knee angle open for when he tried to apply his peak power around about 3 o'clock. But the problem was that is he lost the power at the bottom of the pedal stroke. And he was on 170 cranks, I think, Phil, wasn't he? I believe.
Yes, he was. I think he was I think he was on 170s. Yes.
But he needed to lower his saddle and shorten his cranks to give him more space. But we did get a bit of a resistance there. But he was a really, really powerful rider, had massive quads on him, which is always attractive on a man. And but he really struggled getting the power in. So he only had a short power phase between like 4:30 and 5:30, I'd say. That's all he had to get his power down. But he was unstable, he was uncomfortable. Maybe that's one of the reasons he stopped riding, I don't know. But he really struggled to get on with his bike.
Yeah, so that's Milan there, isn't it? I think first time we saw him. So his hip was really closed up. You can see that graphic there. So his hip is closed at the top, and yet he's overreaching at the bottom. So he's got like a double whammy of being constricted, isn't he?
Yes.
He can't produce power at the bottom, and he's just got a little sweet spot where he can produce power. Very, very uncomfortable. So as I remember, Jules, we went to the truck, or we didn't go to the truck, but we ordered up a special smaller bike for him. We shortened his cranks. We did all this work, didn't we? Thinking, God, this is going to be like a revelation for him, and he hated all of it, didn't he? As I remember.
Yeah, took it back. Didn't like any of it. It's often the case.
Yeah. Can't win them all, can you? It's nice to get all our failures out here in the open with our confession. Yeah, we couldn't really help Julian, did we? But he was a lovely guy, and we really wanted to help him, but we couldn't. So yeah, so here's somebody who we've been talking about what you shouldn't do when you pedal. And Julian, you might want to talk us through this one. This is Sam Bennett. who's a sprinter and a very good sprinter. And there he is. This is quite early on with us working with him, isn't it? It's
Yes.
glitching a little bit here. I might just try and play that again. Look at that power curve, Jules.
Yeah, this is one I was talking about actually.
Okay.
So very symmetrical. So if we look at it, so if you look along the bottom, you can see where we get to the 90 on the left side. So that's where the crank's horizontal. So the power's coming in before, let's say, 3 o'clock, and then he's pushing through on the stroke. So for a certain point in that stroke, he's getting peak power, and then he's dropping away, resting the legs, and then the other leg's taking over. But what's great about this, one side isn't compensating for the other. So he's got he's a quite symmetrical rider, but he's got very, very even power. So, and for a sprinter, he's got great souplesse. So you always imagine sprinters are big, quite heavy guys, big muscles, but he's very, very flexible. And I think you can see this in his pedal stroke.
This literally is completely and utterly congruent, isn't it? I mean, you couldn't make that better, could you? I mean, I've got a suspicion you faked it, because that's just literally a mirror image, isn't it? But not only that, he's producing a huge amount of power in a very small part of the stroke, isn't he? I mean, he's got the example of short ground contact, isn't he?
Yeah, high cadence. You can see that red line on both sides is his peak torque, which is even on both sides. So he's either naturally gifted, he is naturally gifted, but he's maybe over thousands and thousands of kilometers, he's adapted his style to generate that evenness when he's out on the bike. And he is a very fastidious rider, so it wouldn't surprise me if he'd been working on this for a long time. Yeah. But what I might just say about the subject tonight, pedaling like a pro, is a lot of them don't think about pedaling. They think about other things, but they don't go on trainer road, and they don't go on watt bike and try and adapt their power. This is a much more natural way to pedal a bike.
Yeah. So that's our example of somebody who pedals extremely well, Jules. So let's now sum up, before we go into a couple of case studies, let's sum up what we think, what our recipe for perfect pedaling is. And Graham or Alex, jump in if you disagree with any of these, because these are home cooked recipes, if you like. Hopefully data and research driven. So we say only push up, push down on the pedal. Pull up is negligible, unhelpful, and almost always a compensation, which is Jules' specialist subject. Jules, do you want to jump in there?
Yes, if your foot, because your body doesn't know it's on a bicycle, it thinks it's running, it's trying to run with two big heavy planks on its feet. And if it can't feel the ground, say you're heavy pronator, for instance, or one leg shorter, and that foot doesn't make contact with the ground or the bottom of the shoe, you won't know you're doing it, but you may be pulling up on that side to compensate, to try and even out the pedal stroke and try and keep the crank turning at the same speed. Or the other leg, the longer leg, for instance, will be pulling up to help the right leg that's not generating enough power. So you get this sort of dynamic going on in this motor pattern that you can't break out of until you can go and see a bike fitter, for instance, who may improve that ground contact, and then that will even out the pedal stroke. But it's very hard to break out of that pattern.
Yeah, I find as well that people with hamstring injuries and their cyclists tend to have it because they're having a compensation for a lack of balance or pedal power in some other form, usually.
Yes, and it can also give you, if you're pulling up on one side, for instance, you can get back pain on that side where you're pulling up.
Yeah,
because you're using those muscles which are attached to the spine to lift the femur, and that can give you lower back pain.
And the whole pelvis comes up. Yeah.
I mean, and that brings me to a clip I haven't got here, which I have got on my computer. But I remember you got a WhatsApp from one of the director sportives of a very well-known rider, and we sent that WhatsApp to both Alex and to Graham and said, "What's going on here?" And I think that's the point they made, isn't it? Isn't what they said about that certain rider? And we didn't. We
blocked.
Pardon?
Lower it back. Yeah.
Yep, I like that example, Jules. I just think that's a particularly lovely image and what's the word, metaphor, that your body doesn't know it's on a bike. I think that's absolutely right. I've never heard it expressed like that, but I think that's a really nice way to frame it. Your body doesn't, of course it doesn't know it's on a bike. It's trying to run and you're making it strap itself to this Victorian contraption. It's a really nice way to frame it. We either have the evolved hardware or software to meaningfully pull up. So even if you've got the desire planted there by myth or you've read it somewhere, you don't have the hardware, i.e. the muscles aren't big or strong enough or resilient enough, or the software to motor pattern a significant pull up. And we know that because of Dr. Jeff Broker's data. Alex or Graham, do you have a problem with that statement, or is that outlandish?
No, I think I was having a quick trawl of the literature before I came on, and there's a study going back to 1986 that looks at elite cyclists, and it showed that in elite cyclists there was no pull up at all, and that's, you know, and I don't think there's been any research. I think that's been corroborated by subsequent research, and there's nothing to suggest that it should be anything other than that. You get the elite cyclists just don't pull up. Might feel like they do, but when you measure them, they don't.
Yeah, it's like they can't get there. It's like one can't get your foot out of the way quick enough, can you? Pedals coming up. It doesn't matter what you do, you can't get your foot out of the way.
Yeah, it's just the sort of the float up and the other leg driving down.
Yeah, the physiology is not quick enough.
Sorry, Ben.
The physiology is not quick enough, I think, to go push pull.
So does that mean by trying to do it, by trying to get your foot out of the way, you're possibly creating issues there? That's certainly mine and Jules's view.
Yeah, I think so. It's like if you clench your fist, you know, if you want to move quickly, you've got to have your fist loose. And if you're trying to do push pull, it's like actually clenching your fist and then trying to move it quickly. You're just kind of fighting against yourself.
Yeah, good example.
I've just got a question here, Philip, gents. What it says, the question is, don't pull up, yeah, cool. But what about drag across the bottom and push across the top? That's the D. That's some people advocate the D technique, don't they, to pedal? How do we feel about that?
So that's what you were talking about in the first video, wasn't it, Phil? The scraping the foot across.
Yeah, that's the hamstring thing again, isn't it? Yeah.
But hamstrings like speed, so it's like if you're doing anything quickly, so you're trying to scrape, would be fine rather than a continual pull. They're no good at that. They're no good at that.
No,
and with the hamstrings, when you're cycling, they get shorter anyway because they're never fully extended. So if you start trying to pull the pedals with your hamstrings, you're just going to overwork them and make them even tighter, which is going to cause more problems.
So I'd kind of agree with the research that Alex was talking about, but I would go with, a little bit of a scrape might work, but not as a benefit, just to get away with it.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not convinced. I think I think there would be a tendency to just overcook it, because where do you stop? You know, I think I would actually concentrate on the push and actually try and make that as smooth between your two.
That's going to give the smoothest outcome. Yeah.
And that'll cover the top and the bottom bits.
Yeah, I'm totally with Alex. I just think that the push and the pull, when you're at 95 RPM and, you know, a couple of 100 watts, it's like, really, you know, we have that fine calibration. As Jules says, it's, you know, your body doesn't know it's on a bike. It's an artificial environment. Your body is trying to run, strapped to this contraption. I'm not sure we've got that fine motor pattern control. I think it's much safer just to keep it really, really simple.
Push.
We've got some more questions, lads, while we're on this subject. Technique, dropping the ankles, dorsiflexing the foot through the stroke, and also starting the pedal stroke early before top to center to eliminate the dead spot. What do we think about the dead spot?
I think your push is going to kick in just before the top dead center. I think that's reasonable. Hang on a second, I've got some. Where is it? So Your hip extensors kick in at about 315 degrees. That's 15 degrees before top dead center. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. Your knee extensors are going to kick in about 60 degrees before top dead center. So yeah, I think you do, but it's so you're going to push through before that.
So how much are they contributing? It's going to be negligible, isn't it?
Well,
you'll get a little bit just before top dead center. Again, it's just sort of smoothing out over the top of the crank position, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's not borne out by the data, Alex. If you look at the data here, this is an aggregation of 100 pro and elite cyclists. Crank is negatively weighted there at 11 o'clock. It's neutral at 12 o'clock, and then you start to get positive. Pardon?
Yeah, no, I'm just agreeing with you. I'm looking at an older piece of research that's just looking at, it's not looking at force output, it's looking at muscle activation.
Yeah, and I think we had this conversation before you put on the call onto the webinar. You know, there's a difference between force application and power generation. You know, because at the bottom of the pedal stroke here, you've got masses of force onto the pedal, but none of it's doing any good, really. I mean, that's not entirely true, actually. There's like a little bounce off the bottom. There's like a little, you're getting a little bounce off the bottom. That's not true, but you've got a massive force here. But not all of it's going into the crank at the right angle, is it?
Yeah.
And here you've got an aggregation of all these great cyclists, and none of them can offset the weight of the crank and the leg.
Yeah.
I think if you
Thing is, it's all right doing these on an indoor trainer for 45 minutes. But if you get to the end of the Marmot and you get to the first ramp of Alpe d'Huez, you stop pulling on the second pedal stroke. There's no way your body can do it.
Yeah, the other thing to bear in mind is all of these are in the saddle and none of them are out of the saddle as well.
So any of these techniques only work on indoor trainers. They don't work in real life. But then you've got to ask yourself, why are these companies? What are we trying to gain by changing this pedal stroke? What are we trying to gain? Why are we trying to make it elliptical, and why are we trying to push through and pull back? What are we aiming for?
Well, that's my thought about over ankling as well. Because if you're doing that, you're directing the force to focus around the ankle, whereas really it should be the whole kinetic chain involved, and the biggest baby in the whole chain there is your glutes. So they should be dominating with the quads in every sense. So if you then start making the ankle drop, the heel drop so much, you're kind of losing a little bit. It's like cycling on sand.
I totally agree with that, Graham. I think that's absolutely right. If you look at the guys who now are, you know, superb pedalers and produce huge amounts of power, they don't really drop their ankles. They just keep the foot the same angle all the way around, practically. I mean, a little bit. I mean, you know, that whole over ankling nonsense is gone now, Jules, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if you look at Jan Ulrich when he used to ride, but you know, if you're old enough to remember that,
I am.
You know, he was dorsiflexing, and he was driving through with his, you know, he had a slow cadence, and then you go 20 meters up the road, usually, and Lance Armstrong would be there, plantar flex with a higher cadence. So you had two different techniques which suited two riders. But what we see in the studio is if you freeze someone's pedal stroke at 90 degrees horizontal to the ground, and their ankle is dropping below the pedal, the pedal crank, you know that they're dorsiflexing and they're destabilizing that leg, because their heel's dropping because they're not engaging their met heads, so they're struggling to plantar flex. They're looking for end range.
We might need to explain that, Jules. I think that, I mean, I totally agree with you, but I think we need to explain that. If I go back to if I run that clip of
I've got a quick question here about cleat position while I run it. Do we think positioning the cleat further back, you know, you get a lot of midfoot cleat position. Do we think that's of benefit? I mean, it's not just moving the cleats back, but like midfoot. Some proponents of that technique to stabilize and reduce dorsiflexion. How do we feel about that? I know how I feel about it, but I just thought I'd ask you.
It sounds like it's come from a bike fitter, that question.
I don't know. A gentleman called John Bremner.
Do you want to take it, Jules?
I'll take it, yeah. So I'd say midfoot cleat positioning. I don't know where that came from, but if you think you've got two, obviously you've got, in most cases, you've got two legs on a bike, and they're not always in the same length. The hips aren't always in the same position. The feet aren't always the same length. So the only adjustments you can make in that position is your foot angle. So if you shorten that lever, so there's no adjustment in that foot angle, you can't compensate for any asymmetry. So I would discourage people from midfoot cleat placement, in my answer. And if they're doing it for stability, they need to find the stability elsewhere with better foot control.
Yeah, or it might be they're doing it, Jules, because there's pain under the metatarsals, in which case address that rather than address the cause rather than address the symptom.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay. So
we're on
you were just saying
past 7, Phil, by the way.
Okay, fine. All right, let's wrap up. Sorry. I was just going to try and explain your bit there about. I was just going to try. Oh God, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know where I'm going now. I'm just like all over the place. Hold on. Let's go back. I just want to quickly wrap up the takeaways, and I wouldn't mind just showing if we can one case study if we can. If we can't, so use a crank length that you like and reflects your hip inflection range. The research from Dr. Jim Martin is very clear. Crank length doesn't have an effect on peak power. Use a cadence that feels natural. Heavy legs are working against gravity more with a faster cadence. I've cued you in here, if you want to come in on this. But essentially, there's a lot of negative energy out there about guys using cadences of 80, 85. It's like, well, geez, if you've got big heavy legs or you're and you've got strong legs, it might that might be more effective for you. It might be okay for somebody who's quite light legs to work 110 RPM, but every time that leg's going back on the backstroke, it's working against gravity, and there's nothing you can do about that initial pedaling in space. Do you want to come in on that, Jules?
I think, well, let's go back to the Jan thing, isn't it? It's just about the individual and how they generate the most power and where they're comfortable. There isn't the high cadence thing came in with Lance, and then everybody went out and tried to copy him, but it didn't really suit.
Yeah, missing ingredient there. The thing is with Ulrich, I mean, Ulrich for me he used to dorsiflex like crazy because he used to drive a really big gear, and if you drive a really big gear, dorsiflexing or dropping the heel is a way of effectively introducing more movement into the lever system, which lowers the gear, right?
Sorry, I was reading a question, Phil. Lost you.
That's fine. No, I think I lost myself. Okay. You're a V-twin, not an electric motor. You've evolved to produce power in staccato bursts. Don't worry if you're a lumpy staccato pedaler. That's kind of how you've evolved. Running is a staccato business, right, Alex?
Yes, well, one foot in front of the other. So, yeah, it has to be really.
Yeah. We were talking before you came on the webinar, Alex, that it's slightly ironic that a lot of pedaling drills are teaching cyclists to have longer contact with the pedal, pulling back, pulling up. And I was saying before you came on, that in elite runners, you're always trying to shorten your ground contact, aren't you?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
Float through the air.
Float through the air. Yeah, exactly. As little horizontal deviation as possible, because you want that reactive strike off the ground. So you only get that by a really short contact time.
So yeah, so we've evolved, surely that's our primary evolved function, isn't it? We didn't evolve to ride bikes, we evolved to do exactly that, didn't we? Hit the ground for short amounts of time and produce masses of extensive power, didn't we?
Well, we did once upon a time. Yeah, that might have changed with the advent of trainers and all sorts of other foot things. But yes, that is the plan, or that was the plan.
So the other takeaway here, inappropriate foot support could result in unhelpful pedaling adaptations. Jules and I did a Cyclefit TV module on this, which is on our YouTube channel. Jules led fascinating insights, his insights into some of the pro riders in the pro peloton, Lance being one of them, Peter Sagan being the other, and your favorite new rider, Jules, whose name I can't remember.
Pao Bilbao.
That's him.
Yeah.
So inappropriate foot support could result in unhelpful pedaling adaptation. And then something I'd absolutely stolen from Alex If in doubt, try Cyclefit's prescription pedaling paracetamol, pedaling in flat in trainers on flat pedal. And this is something which we've done for years and years and years. When an athlete or a client or someone's really struggling and their pedaling has all become discombobulated and dysfunctional, first thing we do, flat pedals on, put them in their street shoes, trainers, and have them pedal and look at the power. And 9 times out of 10, the whole thing just calms down, doesn't it, Bill? And,
yes.
and they start to smile again. So we know that there's a motor patterning issue that we need to resolve that's crept in because they're adapting around something. And their pedaling has become complicated and dysfunctional. And on that note, if I can just introduce one case study here, and this gentleman won't mind me sharing this because he said we could use it as a teaching resource. But anyway, I won't share who he is. A European pursuit champion, very, very, very good cyclist. But he fell off and broke his hip, and then he was had very, very successful surgery. Was presented at Cyclefit after 10 days post-surgery. Came in an Uber on crutches, got into his cycling kit and jumped on, and just wanted to make sure that everything was working right, even though he's going to be weak and a bit wobbly after surgery. To want to make sure that everything was functioning and firing right. And then we immediately came up with this is how he pedaled immediately, and it's like, no, it's not right. It's very, very wrong, and you're going to hurt yourself because the left side is obviously just shut down and doing nothing, and then the right side was being overactive everywhere through the pedal stroke as a very early adaptation 10 days post-surgery. And this guy is one of Alex's clients as well, and I put all this through to Alex and saying this is what we're facing, Alex. So we came up with almost like a pedaling prescription, which was flat pedals, short crank, straight bars, 3 months. And this image here is actually him pedaling about 20 minutes after this one on flat pedals, not clipped in, flat bars, short cranks, the whole thing. And you could see that it's not obviously, he's a very, very serious injury and a very big operation. So, he's not like he's firing, but you can see there's a little bit more congruency to the curves, and the left side's actually having to work a wee bit, and the right side has calmed down on the recovery stroke. Alex, he's your client, so you may want to comment there.
I think I think the graph kind of just sums it up, really. That it's difficult to argue with that picture. If he'd carried on doing what he had been doing in sort of the first graph, you're going to start to ingrain some fairly unpleasant compensation patterns that you're then going to have to spend ages repatterning if they don't cause you more problems. If you can start to reinforce the positive ones early doors, then that's only going to be positive and a quicker recovery time.
Yeah, I've used that patterning myself with surgery to my ankle. I had a graph similar to the one on the left, and cleated on one side, flat on the other, and been using that as part of training. Definitely improved.
Yeah, and I've had hip surgery as well, and done the same thing. So I can give it no higher accolade than it's what I do for myself, really.
Yeah.
So
and we see too many people with knock-on effects of thoracolumbar or pelvic pain because of weakness down the kinetic chain.
Yeah.
And clipping pedals.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it allows you to cheat basically much more.
I did have a question before. A gentleman sent us a question before, and he was asking about the benefits of power meters. And other than the actual benefit of the power reading is the left and right power. I think it can be a big aid to improving your pedal stroke by trying to even out that power, if that's what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Philip, have we finished now?
Yeah, we could go on because I've got
Your slides have gone, so I'm wondering.
Sorry?
Your slides have gone, so I've got a couple of questions here. How do we get more power from the glutes? Is it concentrating on pushing down, or is there a position in which the glutes can work better? It's on a bicycle.
Pelvic position.
Stability around the pelvis. Yeah.
Yeah.
What pelvic position, though, gentlemen?
So neutral to anterior, well, probably neutral. I think if you can get to that first of all, so you're less posteriorly rotated. I don't know if you differ with that at all, Graham, but that's my thoughts.
No, I'm agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, if your pelvis is bobbing around, then you're going to have an asymmetry in your glute power.
Yeah.
Jules and I, from a cyclist perspective, I would add in there stand up. If you want your glutes to fire more, stand up and pedal. Bring your weight forward.
Or train off the bike to get your glutes stronger, and it will integrate into the bike.
Yeah,
I love that.
And hill training.
Hill training, deadlifts.
Okay, I've got to do these quickly now. A quick next question. What do you think about Q rings? How to pedal through the dead spot?
That's you, Jules. That's you. It's all you, that one.
That is all you.
That's not me.
It's all you, Jules.
I think Q rings are better when you're under a heavy load, 200 or so watts more, but they're not very good for easy rides. But they are good for climbing because they do move the peak torque a bit further around the stroke. Say that. I have a question. If you have a weaker side, would that side be clipped in and stronger? If you've got a weaker side, should you work it on flats or should you?
That'll be the flat side.
Yeah.
Because it'll force you to push down through that side. But obviously you've got to look at that whole, everything has a knock-on effect. So you don't want to then sit on the side of the saddle and over press on that side as well. So yeah.
I think I put flats on both sides, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's safe.
Otherwise you can compensate, can't you?
Yes.
I've got another one over here because I've got them coming on both sides. Would you recommend doing a session on flat pedals once a week?
I think indoor, yes. And I think I'd do all your indoor sessions on flat pedals.
But with your feet set up correctly within those shoes. So
yeah.
If you need internal wedges or footbeds, you put those in. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But also, like you say, doing stuff off the bike, squats and engaging those glutes, isn't it? It's very important so your body knows where they are.
I think at least a flat pedal session, I think weekly would be good. And I think if you're doing it indoors, actually even outdoors, I think it would be a good idea. I don't think there's any downside to do it on flats.
It's like everything in the Cyclefit process, you know, it's not just about the pedals and of whether they're flat or not. It's about the whole shebang. Yeah, it's how your glutes are working, how your back is flexible, how your hip flexors are flexible, how your hamstrings are in or not involved. You know, all those things have to be looked at, and so you can't just go, oh, I'll get some flat pedals.
Yeah, that's true.
Do you think people go any quicker with clip-in pedals?
No. You?
Well, I think
psychologically, you might be feel more positive. Psychologically,
higher cadence. I think lower cadence with flat pedals, but more power, more symmetry. I've got another question, and then we should wrap it up. I think, guys. What is the common change to pedaling style when you move indoors, and what injuries does that bring, or could it bring?
There's a proprioceptive change there because your bike's not moving around. You're not moving around on the bike. So it's not such a natural form.
I'm seeing a lot more hip flexor tightness in people doing loads of turbo sessions, especially when they're hitting heavier resistances.
Yeah.
You just get more crushed.
Higher cadences, I guess. So probably a higher cadence than you use outside. And you don't have to stop, do you? So you can do a 12-minute threshold session without even turning a corner or going over a bump. So I think
you're patterning the same thing, and it's over patterning creates the overuse injuries. So if you've got a subtle anomaly in your pattern, you're just overusing it.
Yeah.
So it's a good adjunct, obviously, but it's not the must-do training.
Yeah. So thank you, everybody, and thank you especially Alex and Graham. Yeah, lovely insights there. I can't believe that all four of us absolutely agreed that we should all be pedaling once a week on flat pedals, and lovely. And very gratifying that we're all united on that. So we'll be back here in 2 weeks, won't we, Jules?
Yes. I think Alex might bring some exercises with him.
Fantastic.
Not to put under any pressure to follow up from our first webinar.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for spending the time with us. Great fun, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks' time.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Graham. Thanks, Alex.